We're really excited about today's topic. We are ready to get started here. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. Please, we want to make sure that you are participating, so turn your cameras on. This is a way for us to get connected and to get to really feel connected with one another. If you can, make sure that your mic is off. You want to make sure that when you're showing up that we don't have any interaction, so we will make sure that your mic is off if we hear any noises, so please make sure that your mic is off. This is being recorded, so we'll be sending over an email with the link in about 1 to 2 business days. And please use the chat. So you can send me over a message privately if you would like to remain anonymous. And also make sure that you're keeping up with us on social media. So we are at Power to Fly everywhere, but make sure that you get to our YouTube channel where you can see all of this good stuff. So today we have our incredible speaker, Hannah Olson. So Hannah is the co-founder and CEO of Disclo, the first software company helping employees safely asking, verifying, and acting on accommodation requests at work. Hannah's own experience navigating in her career while undergoing intensive treatment for Lyme disease sparked the idea for her first venture, Chronicle Capable, which is now one of the largest and most used disability recruiting platforms in the country. She is known globally for her disability advocacy with features in Forbes, Inc. magazine, Fast Company, and more. All right, so let me go ahead and get into the questions here. Let me stop sharing my screen so that we can see Hannah. Hannah, welcome so much to this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay, so before we get started, we do want to see your questions, so definitely put them into the chat. But while I will say, while Hannah has a law background, we want to make sure that there are no legal questions that are being asked because she won't be able to answer those. So try to keep them as general as possible when it comes to questions surrounding disability. So the first question I have here for you is, what is your main advice for facilitating disability disclosure at work? How can we encourage it within our workforce and make people feel a little bit more comfortable with disclosing?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kick this off, I think, disability disclosure is a sensitive topic for a lot of people out there. It's one that was sensitive for me. And I think there's so many tactics that we can try, but there's a few that I like to point to in this question. And so I think first and foremost is to make employees feel comfortable sharing. And that may seem kind of vague, but this really happens when employees are trusting that their managers aren't going to treat them differently and that they will actually help make adjustments to better accommodate their needs. And so if a manager can ask their employees what they need to succeed, that really helps open up this kind of line of communication. So I recommend that as leaders, you encourage your managers to have these conversations and ask, what could make work more fulfilling and more meaningful for their teammates. I think number 2 is sharing the benefits of disclosure. Again, for many employees, and I'll probably say this several times today, disclosing can be very scary and very daunting. And there are so many benefits of disclosing. So we want to actually share those things like access to accommodations, increased job satisfaction, not having to hide a huge piece of your identity at the door each day. So as a company, it's really important that we're communicating that disclosing isn't going to harm your career. A third tip is to share success stories. Growing up, I rarely saw people with disabilities in leadership positions. I saw women rising to power. I still think we have so much to go in that realm. But on the same note, companies should really provide opportunities for people with disabilities to advance in their careers. When people with disabilities at your company see their peers participating in mentoring programs, getting promoted, being valued for their feedback and for their opinions, it really kind of signals to them that the company is taking this seriously and actually cares about disability inclusion. And then lastly, I'd say, creating disability employee resource groups and ones that really focus on not only people with disabilities, but also allies. This is a really empowering way for people with disabilities in your company to network with each other and to bring up different situations that they're seeing and bring that to leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I really love your emphasis here, like being able to show up as your whole self. When we're taking a look at what inclusion and belonging really looks like, it definitely looks like that. So thank you for those thoughts. So what would you say is the best way to accommodate requests? So how should we proceed if we can't commit to one of those requests?
Yeah, so I'd say first off, before I get into the technicality of it, I think something that's usually left out of this conversation of how do we address requests is just the simple discussion of empathy, human empathy. Again, it can be really daunting for someone to have to disclose such a vulnerable piece of them and then to ask for accommodations on top of that. And so when a manager or HR leader kind of responds with either hesitation or annoyance or, these types of attitudes, it can be really painful for that individual. So I'd say before like the technicality of how you respond to these requests, respond with empathy. I'll get now into kind of the legal perspective. And just to make a correction, I do not have a law background. I'm not an attorney. So just to note, this is not legal advice at all. I'm just very versed in the ADA. But as a company, when someone does disclose and ask for accommodations, you should be prepared to engage in what's known as the interactive process. This kind of interactive process, if you're not familiar, it's involving a review of the accommodation requests from the employee, or in some cases from a healthcare provider. So if a disability is invisible or not apparent, which 70% are, as a company, you do have the right to request a verification and to go directly to that medical provider. So if you do seek to go that route and verify this, something to note is that if you're not aware of this, no medical information can be stored inside of your human resource system, so your HRIS or your applicant tracking system, your ATS. And so what we learned is that many employers are resorting to sticky notes and spreadsheets to track this information. Internally at Disclo, we like to refer to this as the sticky note gate. If you do a Google search, I think it's really interesting to see that sticky notes have been subpoenaed in court several times. The ADA doesn't require that requests be in writing, but if you have documentation of a request, that's always good practice. So you can actually track all of these interactions, but make sure it's in a safe space, detached from the employee file. I will say I'm biased and I didn't get a chance to introduce myself, but we recently started a company called Disclo. And Disclo is a place where folks can disclose and request accommodations at work. The company can then approve those requests, or they can request a verification in which we interface directly with the medical provider. But what's really special is we actually never share the underlying condition with the employer. And I think that's really, really important because it's a very safe space that you can offer for your employees. And so I'm biased here. So I think that's going to be a really safe practice of using. But into the second question of not being able to commit, I'd say, as a company, be very wary of just denying something outright. And this process should be taken very seriously and done correctly. You can't just deny something off the bat because you think we can't do this. You have to engage in the interactive process and you must offer alternatives. So for example, if someone is requesting a $1,000 screen reader software, but you think, that may be out of budget for us, you can come back to that individual and engage and maybe suggest a $500 one, but you have to engage in this negotiation because you have to be able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the employee either doesn't have this disability or they can't perform their job duties. Or that they can perform their job duties without this accommodation. And so be very wary of this. I think, really importantly, what we did on the Disclo platform is we actually try to discourage denials and push people to really go through this negotiation process, because that's where we see, if you go to the EEOC's website, which if you're not familiar, the EEOC is the federal agency that sues companies for not doing this correctly. If you read through the cases, the disability cases, oftentimes it's because X company denied this request and employee experienced this. And so we try to really steer away from that. And just to note on that front, disability is now the #1 category of cases filed within the EEOC. So it's something we want to take really seriously. And again, I am not a licensed attorney, but I do encourage you to check out either the resources on our website on Disclo or the Job Accommodation Network to learn a bit more about that process.
Absolutely. And I think that Disclo is an amazing resource, especially for those of you who are in the US. We do have a wonderful global audience. So what I would say is to make sure that you're taking a look at what the employment laws are in your country as well, in case you had any questions, because it can look different from country to country. We just got a great question from Jay, who asked, why do why do recruiters not ask about disabilities? I think that recruiters might benefit and it may be key to helping the applicant. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think it's something we're going to get into in one of the questions. But as a company or as an employer, you're not able to upfront ask someone unless they disclose this to you. What we see now on a job description is there's typically that question of, do you have a disability or do you not? And there's typically, I think it's like 6 to 8 different conditions or disabilities that are listed there. And so a lot of people will just say no. Actually, right now, only about 3% of people say yes or disclose their disability to their employer. But per the ADA, you can't just outwardly ask someone unless they disclose that to you. And so that's kind of why that happens. But there are ways to encourage disclosure, which I'm sure we'll get into and to make that a more comfortable process.
Absolutely. Okay, so next question here. How can a company access its level of disability inclusion? What would you say are some of the principal things companies need to consider when they're looking to move forward with increasing their level of inclusion at work?
It's a great question. There's a lot of certifications and organizations out there that rate companies, and we'll kind of go through a verification of companies, and they're rating them on, are you a disability friendly organization? Those are awesome, but I think there's also ways that you can assess this without having to go through those processes and oftentimes have to pay for that. So I think first off, you want to review your policies. That includes your job descriptions, your accommodation offerings. And so you should ask yourself these questions. Are we using language that discourages people from applying to our jobs, such as has to lift 50 pounds for a remote marketing job? I've seen that way too many times. Or are our job applications accessible to people? Can you actually go through the process and apply for this role? Or are there barriers that exist for people who may have disabilities? Are we promoting access to accommodations? I think these are all questions that we can ask ourselves. Even though I run 2 companies in the disability inclusion space, I still ask myself these questions. Are we doing this right? Are we, you have to look within. I'd say another piece is encouraging open communication and listening to the feedback from your employees. We hear all the time about people who speak up to their company and then the company just ignores those requests. And so that's really important. Are we actually listening when our employees bring up these discrepancies or these challenges? And so the key to inclusion, I think, is truly looking within and think to yourself, are we creating a culture of diversity and inclusion, or are we creating a culture of diversity, inclusion, and belonging? The goal is belonging. And when people feel like they belong, they're going to feel a lot more comfortable in sharing these things. And so really look within, assess yourselves, think to yourself, if I can put myself in that person's shoes, would I be able to access support at work?
Absolutely. Well, we talked a little bit here about disclosure, but what do you recommend including disability disclosure in the interview process? And if we do have that, how can we make candidates feel secure and comfortable throughout the process from beginning to end?
Another great question. So per the ADA, people can disclose at any point in their employment. That can happen during the interview. It can happen once you get hired. It can happen 6 years into the job because disabilities happen at any point in our lives. Again, I'm pretty biased because I'll say that you should have a solution like Disclo in place to help facilitate these disclosures and offer it in a safe way. But a tip I'll say here is that obviously you can't, as I mentioned before, you can't outright ask someone if they have a disability. That person needs to be comfortable enough to share. But a positive tactic that we've seen is sharing success stories of others within the company. So people who've actually accessed accommodations, you don't have to say that person's name, but we had an employee who came to us and needed to work remotely because they've got a child at home with a disability. And so we allowed that. And so sharing these things kind of shows that you're a company that's actually in practice including your employees. I think sharing the policies and accommodations that you offer is really important as well. Usually disclosure and accommodations is a conversation that the employee is forced to initiate themselves, and that's like sheer need and also the law. You can't just ask someone outright. And so if we open the floor and we bring this up during the interviews, that might make people open up more. And so when we invite people to interview, another thing I often tell our partners is that companies, HR managers, or talent acquisition folks, they'll send interview instructions or details to that interviewee. It'll say like, you've got to come to the Zoom link and here are your questions. In these, we want to also include a piece in there about maybe, do you need accommodations for the interview? Bring that up, show that you're forward thinking and that you're thinking about this as something that you're not forcing that person to do it, but you're saying, do you need any accommodations for the interview? It really shows that you care and that you're thinking about it top of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And even some folks who are able-bodied can find that some of those accommodations are going to be really beneficial for them in the process. A really great question has come through here from Marissa on the other side of that. So let's say that it's been disclosed that an employee has a disability and they're struggling with something, and there may be a resource that's available. How do we go about that? Do we have to wait for them to ask us for the accommodations? Can we make the suggestion? What's the best approach when it's already been disclosed?
Oh, so once it's already been disclosed, you can make suggestions. So if someone comes to you and shares something, you can offer options and resources to that individual. I don't see the question up front in front of me. Here we go. So how do we guide them through? I think, as I mentioned, it's sharing what we have at the company. I'm sure we'll get into this deeper. What resources do we have? Do we have an ERG? Do we have spaces where you can actually feel a sense of belonging? Do we have any special health insurance plans or add-ons that could support that individual? Do we have leave where that individual can go to therapy? Sharing these policies is super important, and something that I think companies miss out on a lot is actually talking about what they currently have. They wait until that person has to come instead of communicating openly about what policies do exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you, Marissa, for the question. Chris asked, can companies anonymously poll employees about disability status?
Companies do this all the time. They're often called self-ID questionnaires. Maybe you've seen this in either an outside company will come in and poll. They're typically anonymous. I think these are great initiatives because it helps you to understand who your people are. Where I feel that they fall short, and this is my personal opinion, is that no action step comes after. If we're asking anonymously and we find out that 10% of our workforce has a mental illness, but we don't know who those people are and we don't know how to support them, and we're not offering resources after that survey, then all we're doing is helping our diversity report. And so I think it's really important that we're encouraging ongoing disclosure, that it doesn't happen once a year so we can plaster something on LinkedIn and say, hey, we're a company that's got 7% representation. I think we have to figure out who. And so again, I'm not trying to self-promote here at all, but one of the big things that we did with Disclo is we wanted it to be actionable. You're disclosing for the purpose of getting an accommodation. You're not just disclosing to use Disclo so that people know. It's because you need access to an accommodation at work. And so by that, the company knows their disclosure rates. They know how many people in their workforce have a disability. But there's an action step, which is now that person's getting an accommodation and we can guide them through. So yes, this happens all the time. If you look up, most big companies will have an annual diversity report. But oftentimes I say to companies, well, do something after that. With the learnings of that, offer some more resources, reconsider your benefits, reconsider training. So it's definitely something that happens, but maybe not always perfectly.
Right. So it needs to go beyond just checking the box. I completely.
Yes. Disability is not a checkbox exercise. I always love to say that.
100% agree. So what is your advice for making the onboard processing more inclusive, considering that we might not know if some of the folks that are being onboarded have a disability?
Yeah, so I think similar to what I mentioned in the interview process, when we send onboarding materials, it's really important that we mention disclosure and accommodation policies. Usually people don't know. We get this question all the time is, When do I disclose and how do I do this? And so when you're onboarding a new employee, lay that out for them. So for example, I'm going to use the name Company X. So at Company X, we provide accommodations to employees who may need them. If you do need access to reasonable accommodations, here's how you can request them. And I think, that's a great way of just communicating your policies. I give a lot of lunch and learn sessions with companies, and companies from all sizes, typically like unicorn startups to enterprises. And funny enough, every single lunch and learn session, a discussion starts in the group chat of what's the accommodations process at our company, and like, who do we disclose to, and how do we go about this? And I can't say anything to those questions because I don't work at those companies, but it always is a conversation. And I think it's so interesting because companies are usually forgetting to just tell their employees how you can go about this process. And that just adds this more fear that builds up for that person, because now they're thinking, I've got to share this really vulnerable piece of me. And also, how do I do it? Who do I tell? Like, how do I go about this? And so I think it's really important, again, that we're communicating and telling people on an ongoing basis. It can't be just once during the onboarding. It should happen frequently so people know these processes and know how to go about them.
Absolutely. Bart asks, what are your thoughts about executives disclosing mental health disabilities? Is there a fear that this could hurt confidence or investment in a publicly traded company? And also, how do we get them comfortable with sharing this without having a negative impact on potential investors?
Yeah, it's a great question and a very personal one. So, and I don't want to, speak too much to it because I'll give my own piece here. I'm a person who's a CEO that has sought investments, has gotten outside investments. I'm very comfortable sharing, but it's taken me a long time to get here. I self-identify as having an invisible disability. I didn't tell people for a really long time because I was uncomfortable because I felt those same things. When I walked into investor meetings, that was kind of my brand, right? I've got companies that help people like this, but I think deep down, we need more leaders to stick up and say that they have a disability. I said this before. Growing up, I never saw leaders with disabilities. I was part of that generation of we're starting to see women rising to power, but I never saw a disabled person rise to power. And that was something that was hard growing up because I'm like, I'm never going to have, or going through college, I'm like, I'm never going to have a career. I'm never going to climb that ladder because no one else has. And so I think disclosing is entirely up to you. It is a very personal decision, but it can have impacts and it can help others. And then if an investor doesn't see that your worth and your work ethic are strong, then maybe that's not the right person you want on your team. Again, this is personal advice, but I know firsthand my investors, I don't know if hopefully none of them are watching this, but if they are, I let those people invest in our company because I know that they believe in what we can do. And if a company came to me and said like, oh, you have a disability, so I don't think you're going to be able to stay up late nights and run a company and do these things, I'd say like, hey, I've been able to do it, so you're not the right person for us. And so again, totally personal decision, but it's a good self-assessment of like, are these the right people for me as well? And I've also never worked in a publicly traded company, so just to note that as well.
Yeah. Well, what about beyond like the investment part? The first part of Bart's question was about the fear of that it can hurt confidence. So even in like the staff. So how do we deal with, and a lot of that I think is kind of personal, getting over that kind of hump. But how does somebody get a little bit more comfortable in that, right?
Yeah, so I think understanding, again, disclosure is entirely personal, and I'm not going to tell anyone if they should or shouldn't disclose. But I think understanding the benefits oftentimes goes undiscussed. Most people just think about the fear and shame and stigma that's attached to it, which is real. And it's something that all of us with disabilities have experienced. But there are some really core benefits to disclosing. And I think, you mentioned this before, Noelle. You called apart my point of leaving a huge piece of your identity at the door every day is exhausting. It's psychologically exhausting. And so if you got to show up and do your job and pay your bills, but you also have to like hide a huge piece of who you are, you're probably going to be less apt to perform. You're going to be less loyal to that company. You're going to be, all of these things. And so I think psychologically, there's a lot of benefits of just showing up and being your true self, showing up. And so I'd say that looking into the benefits. There's so many great resources out there. Hopefully, again, if you can look through the Disclo resources, we do have some that share the benefits. But the number one reason you would disclose is to get access to accommodations. And so sometimes people some people might not just want to disclose because they don't need an accommodation, and that's totally fine. But the main reason you would normally disclose is because you need something to be able to do your job and perform at your optimal level. That could be, I need a standing desk, or I need flexible hours. It could be anything, but that's typically why you would go about that.
Right. And how empowering is it when a leader discloses? I can, anytime that I've experienced it, it's always been really moving to me to be able to disclose my own disability. And like you said, it's when you don't have that representation, you don't know if you can climb the ladder. But even if getting to, a leadership position isn't your goal, just being able to see it, if the CEO has a disability and they're willing to share it, then even me, who is at like an entry-level position that really loves entry-level roles, I can do really well and succeed in what I do. So it really does help open the door and knowing what is really possible for me to be able to thrive in what I do day to day, right?
Right. Absolutely. I think, we don't realize how many people have chronic illnesses and disabilities. 60% of adults in the United States live with a chronic condition. That is CDC stat. You can fact check me on that. 40% live with 2 or more, also CDC. This is most people we're talking about. This is not a minority population. A small population. The disability community is the largest minority group in the world. But because so few people are disclosing, we don't know that. We don't know who in our company. We don't know. And so I think it's so important that people set examples for others so people can feel more empowered. And it just sets a culture of, hey, it's okay to be you, and do what you want to do. And I think that, yeah, it's a huge issue in today's workforce. Hustle culture, it's going out.
Yes. And I'm grateful for the Zoomers for like pushing that even more for all of us. So a team member has recently disclosed that she suffers from chronic depression. How can we rapidly show our support? We currently don't have any company policy, and I'd love to make her feel that she's in a safe environment.
Great question. Teammates are really important, and usually we talk about how does the company respond and how does the manager respond, but we don't think about what if one of our colleagues discloses to us. Allyship is so key to disability inclusion. I'm positive we'll get deeper into that. However, I think, again, responding with empathy. I remember in my first job out of college, I moved down to DC, and I was really sick with Lyme disease. I had a PICC line placed in my arm, which, if you're not familiar with, it's a permanent IV, which I was hooked up to antibiotics for 8 hours a day. And I had a company that quite literally did not allow me to do this at work. I now know my rights. I now know that's illegal. But at the time I didn't. I was like an innocent newbie out of college. And what meant the most to me during that year in that company was that my friend, her name was Raquel, she always had my back. She'd sit with me in the bathroom during my lunch break so I could administer my meds. We'd like go on work walks so I could do my antibiotics during the day. And she always waited for me to ask for help. She didn't overstep and like try to touch my IV bag or these types of things, but she was always there for me and I never felt alone. And so I'd say like, be like a Raquel, create trust, don't overstep, but be there when your team members need you. It doesn't have to be something where you're going out of your way and making it a thing, but just be there. I'm in my career, I'm forever grateful for having a Raquel.
Mm-hmm.
Raquel means nothing to you all, but I'm using her as an example of that kind of person.
We all need that person in our corner when we're going through it. And those are the people that we never forget. So I appreciate that. Let's see. Do you have any recommendations for training and disability awareness for employees? And I feel like you have a great answer for that.
Yeah, I mean, so many resources. I'm sure my colleague Shanique, if she's in the chat, she can share a few as well. Lunch and learns. We've been so booked with lunch and learns this year, and I think there's such a great way to get people who maybe aren't interested in learning about this, and then realizing how important it is. Lunch and learns have been so moving for me and for our team as speakers, because you get to really talk to the companies and see and hear from these employees who really just don't even know, and have so many questions. So starting those, starting those kind of sessions at your company is a great way. The Job Accommodation Network is a great resource by the federal government. And they offer tons of resources on accommodations, disclosure, these types of things. Our two companies, Disclo and Chronically Capable, tons of resources out there. There's so much. And I think if you have a company newsletter or these types of things, sharing resources, letting people know. This month is Disability Pride Month. It is not trending on any social media platform. It's a problem. We are not sharing. We are not talking about this. We are not educating. And so use these times to educate your employees. Tell people, hey, it's Disability Pride Month. Here, if you didn't know, here are some resources of how we can be better allies, how we can promote disclosure, these types of things. Talk about it, read. There are so many resources out there. And I always like to say, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but a lot of companies and people will ask like, well, how do I do this? And I think it's important to note that it's not always up to the person with a disability to educate you as the individual. It's great because then you can hear from their perspective, but it also involves you putting in the work, doing the research, and encouraging your employees to do that and go through that process. So yeah.
Excellent. And I hope that anyone who's writing down resources, I really hope that that you check all those out, because there's going to be great for you.
Yeah, and I'll share, actually, I have a thing, and I'll do it probably towards the end because I need to pull it up, but I have a list called my Hannah's list of resources. I typically share it when I give lunch and learns. It's kind of my running Google Doc of resources that I find helpful. And so feel free to check it out. It's, again, just people I like to follow, things I find helpful. There it is. I update it when I find new things. So hopefully that can be helpful to you all and sharing. And it's not a sponsored list or anything like that. It's just my own personal things I've found.
Thanks for sharing that, Hannah. So a question that's come through from LinkedIn is, as job seekers, how can we determine if a company is really serious about disability inclusion?
Yeah, I think this is something we're probably going to get into. There's a lot here. I think, when you look at a company, oftentimes companies will have D&I statements. They'll have outwardly facing things that say, we're a company that cares. And again, those diversity reports that are like, we're representative this much. But it's, who's walking the walk and not just talking talk. So I'd say, without having to disclose, but to question when you are in the interview, you can push back and ask them, what are some examples of accommodations that you've offered to employees? What are your sick day policies? What are things that you've done? Do you have a disability ERG? I think, we can gauge that kind of information by their response. And I always love to tell our job seekers on Chronically Capable, or we always love to tell them, it's also your job to interview the company. We're in a really interesting hiring market right now, but as you go through an interview process, interview the interviewee or interviewer. Oftentimes, like, they'll ask you, do you have any questions for us? And people don't have questions, or they ask like, how many days off do I get a year? Use those opportunities to ask those questions, put them on the spot, and ask, what are your policies? Have you gone through accommodations? Also, just do some, digging into their careers page. Do they share their health information or health insurance provider information, these things. But yeah, those are some good starting points.
Excellent. Thank you. So a private message that I got here was focused on for folks who have cognitive disabilities. So how do you balance inclusivity and support against what's reasonable for an organization to provide as accommodations? So she said, it is disheartening as a manager and HR leader to have an employee needing accommodations that are a stretch beyond reasonable, and their performance not being able to meet expectation for their essential functions of the role.
It's a great question. And again, I will just note here, I'm not a licensed attorney. So I think the question of reasonable is really challenging for HR leaders. And I understand HR folks were not equipped to understand a medical condition and understand if an accommodation works for that medical condition. And so we hear a lot that HR leaders are like, I don't know what's deemed reasonable and how am I the one to make this decision? Again, you do have the right, if a disability is not apparent or invisible, to verify that disability, to go directly to the medical provider and to ask for medical documentation. If the medical documentation is not sufficient, you can also request that you have your own medical provider that reviews this. And in that case, the company has to pay for that medical visit. I will say that this is something with Disclo that we really tried to do, is to create a way where we are verifying not only that the disability or illness is legitimate, but also that in context, the request makes sense. And so that kind of verification can really help, because the company never knows what that underlying condition is. But what we're doing is we're verifying that, yes, indeed, this person lives with this disability. And yes, this accommodation makes sense in context. And so that's something we really made a huge piece of our platform, because I think this whole thing of HR managers having to deem what's reasonable can be really, really daunting for HR leaders. And so, but yeah, I think first and foremost, you can verify that. And yeah, there's tons of resources on Job Accommodation Network, on Disclo. Yeah.
Excellent. So another question that I have here from you that was sent over to us earlier is, considering many employees choose not to disclose their disabilities, how can we build an inclusive working culture that serves team members that haven't communicated their disabilities to the organization? So for an example, having an unlimited sick time.
Yeah. There's so much I could say here. I'll try to keep this brief and give you the opinion of what I'd look for at a company. I haven't applied for jobs in several years, but if I were to go through this process, I'd think about, does this company have a solid health plan? This is really, really important for people who are living with chronic conditions, disabilities. Does the company have flexible spending accounts? Did they have, yes, unlimited sick days is a big one. Do they communicate their accommodations policy? I think another big one is like, are job descriptions accessible, which is a huge thing. Do they offer lunch and learn sessions are a big one you can do, ERGs. And I think overall, it's like, are we creating a culture of openness? If we create this culture where employees feel comfortable, again, being their true selves, that's going to create a culture of inclusion and belonging, like we talked about earlier. And I think when people feel like they belong in the workplace, they feel like they have a voice and they're going to be more apt to share. And so if we don't know if people have disabilities, we can still build inclusive policies, build inclusive benefits, and create spaces where we're creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. And now that our employees feel safe, they feel like they can disclose that piece of themselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. A question that came through from Emma on the chat was, I've just been appointed as a co-lead for a disability ERG, congratulations, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. It is the only ERG that's never gotten off the ground. Do you have any advice for how I can get people engaged in this ERG?
Great question. I will share a plug for a company that I really like. There's a company called Chezi. Shanique, if you're still here, if you want to share the link for Chezi. Chezi does ERG management. So they help companies to manage their ERGs and do it very efficiently. I think that that's a great place to start. They know everything on ERGs. But I think in terms of getting more participation, you got to have buy-in from leadership. Who from the senior leaders is coming on and joining, get someone in that ERG. Odds are someone in the company has a disability, but also encourage that you don't have to have a disability, but you can be an ally. You can be a parent, you can be a caregiver. I think with ERGs, oftentimes people feel like I can't join because I'm not, I don't self-identify, or people might think like, I don't have a disability, I have an autoimmune disease. You might, with that autoimmune disease, be qualify for accommodations, but I think sometimes people fear that word. So by opening the language, communicating that the ERG is hosting events, getting people involved, but just also not making it feel like you got to disclose anything if you're part of this group. It's just a group where we celebrate the differences within this company, and that we look at the policies and voice those to the company. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great question, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So how we talked about Raquel, but I would love to hear some ways that we can be better allies to our coworkers with disabilities and help them adapt.
I will note that I give an entire lunch and learn on this topic. So try to keep this as brief as possible. Allies are so, so important and so undiscussed. Allyship at its core, I think it equals action. It's really difficult or oftentimes really difficult to advocate for issues if you don't understand or if you're not immersed in it. So step one of being an ally is showing up and being willing to understand. And so y'all are here today. Thank you. That is allyship and showing that you're caring and wanting to learn. But allies really, I think, need to show their support by speaking up against ableist language, addressing ignorant remarks and mindsets, and turning these into opportunities for change and for growth within the company. We hear all the time that companies or someone said something really nasty in a group chat or at a company meeting and no one said anything and no one stuck up for that person or said to that person that's wrong. If we're not doing that, we're not creating a culture where anyone's going to feel like they can disclose, like they can be themselves, because that was just allowed. So I think speaking up is so important. Second, educating yourself. I think I said this before, like we don't always want to ask minority groups to educate ourselves. Like our education is not someone else's burden. Follow disability leaders on Instagram, on LinkedIn, whatever you like to do. Educate yourself on the company's policies and never stop learning. I think like I have learned so much in the last week and I've been in this space for several years now. So like just continue to immerse yourself. Things are always changing. Put in that effort. Understand just the differences of each person's experience. The disability community is so diverse. Every person is different. Someone could have the same exact disease and experience that completely different. I know, like in particular in the Lyme disease community, I have so many people with the same diagnosis as me who've probably had similar treatment paths, but we have experienced the illness completely different. And so listen to these different stories, understand that not everyone has the same views and not everyone has the same preferences. We've all caught on, I'd say, to using pronouns and thinking about that in the workplace. Let's transfer that same kind of practice into this space. Everyone is individual. Listen, allyship, make your content accessible. Even if you're not like on the branding team, but you may have documents that you're sending out to your teammates, these things. Always make sure that it's accessible for everyone. There's so much else I could say here, but I'll end with show up imperfectly. Being a good ally is really a process, and I think it's such a journey to understand that we're going to make mistakes along the way, but it's better to be an imperfect ally than it is to be nothing at all. So use these as a learning process, but like always know that we're going to make mistakes. I make them, you'll make them, and that's okay. You can be worried about messing up and saying the wrong thing, but that's not a reason to say nothing at all. Ask questions, don't make assumptions, go figure things out. There's a lot we can do here, but just, show up imperfectly.
Yes, I love that. And when you're talking about education, I can't help it. I'm just crazy about TikTok. TikTok is my absolute jam. So if you
impressive, because if can't figure it out.
It's one of those things like once you figure it out, that's where all of your time goes. But if you are somebody who enjoys TikTok, there's some really great disabled creators who have amazing resources and share their stories in beautiful ways. And there's something about the video form that's really beneficial. So would welcome people to that. So I got a private message here, and beyond anything, any legal actions here, what does somebody do if they ask for an accommodation and somebody says no? If it seems reasonable, so there's no legal implications, but I can see that this would be something simple for them to do, but they're just saying no. Is there anything that I can do to kind of maybe help convince them that it's going to be a good idea?
Well, a company can't outwardly say no. You have to, as a company, engage in the interactive process, which again is that negotiation. The company has to offer alternatives. You can't outwardly just say no. If you get to the point of saying no, you can ask for why, and I need proof of why. Again, I'm probably going to stop there because I'm not an attorney. But yeah, I'm just going to pause there. But you have to engage in an interactive process.
Perfect. Thank you. And that person said thank you. That was all that they needed. So thank you for that. So what would you say are the main barriers that stop, what are the main barriers that are stopping the workforce from becoming successfully inclusive to people with disabilities?
Yeah, there's a lot of barriers. Living, working in this space now, it's really funny because my partner will tell you, like, I'll be at a concert and I'll just realize something is so wrong with the space. Like, I'm always thinking about accessibility and just like, how can we include people? It can be kind of annoying. But anyway, ableism, I think, is huge. There's a lot of isms, sexism, racism, ageism, but oftentimes we don't discuss ableism. Ableism is really the idea of like people without disabilities are superior. That might seem crazy to you that people think that way, but it happens every single day. Ableism shows up in a ton of different ways. It can show up in stereotypes. It can show up in microaggressions. It can show up in discrimination in hiring, like, hey, I'm going to hire this person versus this person because that one has a disability when they have the same qualifications, same skills. It can show up in promotions if we're not promoting people with disabilities. All of these are products of ableism. I'd say another big barrier is implicit bias. You may have heard this term before. It's also known as unconscious bias. And everyone holds unconscious beliefs about different groups or like social groups, identity groups. And these kinds of biases, they tend to stem from how the world categorizes them. So when a situation is really fuzzy to us, or it might lack, structure and it's not very straightforward, we can default to stereotypes. And we tend to run away from people and things that make us uncomfortable. I'll admit I have done this. Again, I hope y'all can close your eyes for a second and think about times you've done this. But when we do it when we're not thinking about it, or we can do it when we're actually thinking about it, but either way, it's unconscious bias. And so these kinds of biases are usually coming from like our personal or our family or life experience. It could be like the attitudes of our family, our friends, culture, movies, media, all of these things. And they develop over the course of our lifetime and usually at a beginning of, usually starting when we're young. And so these are something really a huge barrier to inclusion. And so I think in order to minimize these and mitigate them, we need to be aware. We all have biases. We all say things that aren't correct. And we've all seen other people say things that aren't correct. And so we need to take steps to minimize really how often we're activating these biases and how much they're affecting our decisions. So once we're really aware of that, its next step is like that motivation to change and to manage these. And I think that is what's really critical. So y'all being here today again for this session, this is a great step towards change. Don't stop here. Don't let the work stop here. You've just become aware of all of these things. Now keep working, keep changing. I'm still doing it. I think I like to admit that because it's important that we all show up imperfectly again. But yeah, don't let the work stop here.
You mentioned microaggressions, and there's one microaggression in particular, and I'm being a little bit selfish because this is one that I had to deal with after my brain surgery and me learning how to read and speak, was people saying, oh, I'm just so inspired by your journey. And I know that folks who have disabilities hear stuff like that all the time. So can you speak a little bit to why that can come across as offensive, even though the intention may be to be encouraging?
Called inspiration porn. And yes, it happens all of the time. I've had people say that to me too, and it's annoying. We don't need to say that. They're not, people with disabilities are not inspiring because they've got, we're inspiring because we are living and we're thriving, but this is not something that we don't need to put people with disabilities on a pedestal and make this something that we're, worshiping. It's a bad culture. It's something we want to eliminate. If I have a second, I'll look up this clip from a TV show. That's a great example of why we don't do inspiration porn. So I'll find that for you. And if I can't find it in time, Noelle, I'll make sure to send that to you because it's like the perfect example of inspiration porn. Don't do it, people. It's just not.
I have something to send to you on this day, right? And somebody said, my favorite comment is, you speak so well for a deaf person. I think that we could spend a whole hour just collectively sharing these things, because it can be, something. But another question that I have for you, we're moving in this space from disability awareness to disability pride. So can you talk a little bit about what disability pride means to you?
That's a great question. And again, it's if you did not know, it's Disability Pride Month this month. Again, it's really sad that this is not something that is, and again, things don't have to trend on social media for them to be important, but it's kind of sad. So thanks for asking that question about disability pride. For me, pride means being comfortable, sticking up for what I believe in and sharing my experiences. For so long, I hid that because I was scared that people were going to look at me differently. And I think being able to be proud of who I am in my own unique ways is super important. And so I'd say for me, it's like being proud to be successful, to be helping others. That's a huge piece of who I am. But pride can look different for everyone. Awareness can look different from everyone. So yeah, I think, but yeah, let's please get disability pride trending. Can people start sharing that? We've got like a week left of the month. So, and in 6 days, July 26th is actually the 32nd anniversary of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's get people talking about that.
Do you think for our audience is a little bit more global, if you don't mind just giving us a little bit of a snapshot, because not everyone is familiar with the ADA, what the ADA does?
Yeah, so ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, it started 32 years ago almost. The ADA has been updated a few times, but it's really the laws that exist to protect people with disabilities from discrimination. And that could be discrimination in workplaces, in public spaces, and tons of different things. The ADA has a lot of work to be done. I think it's 32 years, a lot changes in 32 years. So I think we need like a revamp of the ADA, but it is what protects people. And just to note, you do not have to ever mention the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act when asking for accommodations at work, disclosing a disability. That does not have to be mentioned, but it is really important to read it. I took the time I think like 2 years ago, and I printed out the Americans with Disabilities Act and brought it to Staples and bound it. And I went through and like highlighted it and learned. But it's super important that as people with disabilities that we learn what the ADA is and the intricacies of it, because it is the law that exists to support us. And so if I had known all of that several years ago in that first job, I probably would have won a really great lawsuit. I'll spare you all the details, but educate ourselves. I think it's the first step to learning is educating ourselves, and self-advocacy. We have to educate ourselves on the ADA before we can advocate for ourselves at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And these resources to educate yourselves, y'all, it doesn't have to be something that it's a dry white paper. There are really great documentaries. There are a really great, we were talking about, influencers on social media. So make sure that you're taking a look at some of those. So I know that we have just a few minutes left, but I'm wondering if you have any last words, especially because a lot of our audience is disabled. Any words of encouragement that you have for them as they're looking to, walk into their own pride in being disabled and working on, some confidence there?
Yeah, I'd say don't feel rushed. You can come to that whenever you feel comfortable. Everyone's process is different and takes different amounts of times. I think, learning from others, hearing others' experiences is really helpful, because you can weigh the pros and cons of coming out at work in a way. But I think like, don't rush the process. We all need to feel comfortable within our own selves before we can share that with others. And that's when we see the most special pride, is when we can look internally and say, like, I'm proud to be who I am and to share that. But I will say pride is what gets people talking about this. It's what gets those without disabilities thinking about this. I have too many friends that still do not, they say really, really ridiculous things because they're not thinking about this, because we don't talk about disability. Disability is not mainstream. And so I think we got to keep learning, keep talking, keep showing up to these events. And at the end of the day, when we show up to work or to our friendships or to a date, these types of things, as our true self, we're going to be a lot happier. But you have to come to that on your own path, and you're never forced to come out and be proud.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And would encourage folks, we talked about allyship here, to really start making connections with people who have disabilities. It doesn't have to be unauthentic, but I feel sometimes that people think that's because someone has a disability, they have this really heavy cross and that everything is really heavy. Like, people who have disabilities can't be funny, or that everything is heavy all the time. So just want to keep folks to keep that in mind here.
Absolutely.
And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like everything is, and when we're looking at like inspiration porn, like a lot of that is just everything very emotional, everything is very moving, or it's very, very sad. And it's like, we're whole people.
Yeah. I'm not here to yell at you either. I hope you all know, like, this is supposed to be educating, but we're all humans.
Yes, absolutely. So I know we're wrapping up here. Are there any last things that you want to share? I know we have some things here in the chat, how people get connected with you, how to learn more about you, all of that.
Absolutely. So if you're on the job hunt, or if you're a company looking to hire people with disabilities, just to note, we don't accept every company because you got to be really committed. If you're coming to us and just saying like, I want to hire people because I need to fix my numbers, just don't bother. But if you are really committed and you want to hire people, come join us at Chronically Capable. If you're looking for safe ways to help folks with this, or folks in your company, employees, to disclose and to ask for accommodations, encourage you to check out Disclo. It's really, honestly, the first software ever doing this that's helping people to safely ask for accommodations at work. I wish this was something that happened years ago when I was asking for accommodations. So definitely come check out with us, or check us out. We're disclo.com, kind of like disco, but add an L in there, short for disclosure. But thanks all y'all for coming in. I know a lot of you may be on your lunch break or these types of things, but thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here. And yeah, it was great to spend this time with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming and speaking with us. This has been amazing for all of us here at Powerfly. I know we always watch these back, and we'll talk about them together. So thank you so much for your honesty and your expertise. And a few folks are asking if there is going to be recording. There absolutely is. And make sure that you get connected with all the things that Hannah is doing, because it's incredible stuff. So thank you again so much for your time, and thank you everyone so much for joining.